Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of Clearhead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Your gender and sexual identity and mental health have a strong influence on each other. And when you can express your identity openly and safely and feel included in your community, you are more likely to be happy and healthy. But unfortunately, research have shown that the LGBTQ+ community is disproportionately affected by poor mental health. This goes to show that there is an array of issues that affect those who identify different from the heteronormative identity that exists, and it does take a toll on their well-being, leaving many people feeling like they are not really thriving at all. In this webinar, Claire Black, she, her, will be joining us to help unpack the unique mental health challenges that the rainbow community face. Claire was previously the Chief Executive of Outline Aotearoa, a national rainbow mental health support and advocacy charity in New Zealand. During this time, they supported the community through the COVID-19 pandemic, and the highlight for her was launching a chat support function that complemented their phone line service. And they work very closely to ensure that they are advocacy for the rainbow community, especially through their Beyond Binary Code campaign. Claire is passionate about understanding the benefits and harms of digital technology in improving access to marginalised community. Welcome, Claire.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
Well, Claire, why don't we start off with just what got you into this work?
Yeah, great question. So I am a member of the community myself, so I've kind of long been interested in the well-being of rainbow people and particularly that digital side of things. I did my master's thesis looking at how young rainbow people use digital technologies. So that was a year and a half spending time with young people, spending time online, and really digging into the experiences of how the internet and digital technologies can be helpful in really important ways for people's identity and community, but also some of the ways that people have to navigate harm in those contexts. So that was quite a natural fit then for Outline and the sort of telehealth services that organisation provides.
Well, before we get into all the detail, let's just start with the basics, which is, what's the best way to address this community?
Yes, great question. So there's no one umbrella term that everyone agrees is the perfect term that we should use to cover everyone. I'll primarily personally use rainbow communities, which is quite a New Zealand specific way of talking about things. I think often you talk to people from other countries and they're like, what are you talking about? But it's really taken off here in both sort of rainbow sector, government, non-profit contexts as the umbrella term that a lot of people use. Other places might use variations on LGBTQIA+, so sort of subbing in other letters as might be locally relevant. And I've got a quote here from how Outline defines rainbow, because I think it's quite a nice way of capturing all the nuance that falls under that umbrella. So the way that we have described that is that Outline, when Outline is using rainbow and when I'm using rainbow today, that includes people whose sexual orientation, gender expression, or sex characteristics differ from majority binary norms. This includes people who identify with terms like takatapui, lesbian, gay, bisexual, intersex, transgender, queer, non-binary, or whawhawhine, as well as people who don't use specific words for their identity, people whose identity changes over time, or people who are in the process of understanding their own identity and might not have come out to themselves or others yet. So it really does cover a whole breadth of diversity and identity under that. A couple of other terms that I think are worth just briefly touching on Takatapui, which I just mentioned, is a Māori term that encompasses both sexuality and or gender and also aspects of cultural identity. So that's a term that's increasingly being reclaimed by those communities to speak to that sort of unique intersection. And also in Aotearoa New Zealand, you hear about the initials MVP FAF+, and that is, again, a list of different Pacific-specific rainbow identities from different islands and cultures that have strong presences in New Zealand. So lots of different terms, but I'm probably primarily going to use rainbow today. In a study by Te Whatuora, they found that rainbow participants were more likely to report moderate or severe anxiety, moderate or severe depression, high or very high levels of psychological distress, and having ever experienced mental illness. And what do I think causes that disparity? So yeah, something that we see over and over again, including for a long time, we really only saw youth-focused research that was addressing rainbow mental health and well-being. So shout out to Youth 19 and more recently the Identify survey, which have shown these patterns that there is a disproportionate mental health burden for rainbow populations. It's perhaps obvious, but it's really important to be clear that that's not because of rainbow identities themselves. It's because of stigma and discrimination that these groups experience on top of all the other life stresses that people just encounter generally. So there's more overt stuff in terms of homophobic and transphobic harassment that people would tend to be able to recognise: slurs, bullying, violence. That's pretty obvious for the most part. But discrimination can also be more subtle things, like assumptions that everyone is straight and everyone is cisgender. Assuming that if a woman mentions a partner, that's got to be a man. And then every time that happens, she has to decide whether to correct that assumption, which can make people feel othered and invisible over time. It can also be small moments or looks or comments where you're treated differently, what we might call microaggressions, where one instance isn't necessarily a big deal, but if you're constantly getting weird looks or having people use the wrong pronouns or asking intrusive questions, then those really add up to make your experience of the world more hostile. And then, of course, we're not just talking about interpersonal discrimination. People get refused housing or employment because of their identity, and then that feeds into higher rates of things like poverty and homelessness, especially for trans people. And of course, I'm nearly done, but it's also important to note that that can be compounded by other factors like racism, ableism, poverty. There's no one rainbow experience, but people will have sort of different factors that will affect their well-being.
And I guess we started off with the fact that, that even just coming up with one inclusive term was very difficult, and that there were many diverse ways in which people identified. When you shared about these experiences that the community faces, do you feel that that's something that is quite pervasive, or is it quite, small proportion of this is affecting a small group of people, if that makes sense?
I think it's extremely pervasive. I mean, we've obviously had social progress over recent years, and things are better for some people than they would have been. Probably more progress on sexuality than on gender. But even for someone who's just coming out as gay today, there's still all sorts of assumptions, and people have different family environments who might be more or less supportive. So I think everyone has experiences navigating the world as a rainbow person, whatever that looks like, in ways that are different and probably harder for them than it would be for a straight cisgender person. But then, for some people, and again, more common for trans and gender diverse people, these really significant experiences of discrimination that in some ways are getting worse at the moment because of the ways in which it's being used as a kind of political football.
Do you want to share a little bit more detail on what are the unique mental health challenges that the rainbow community faces, and what are the areas that are getting worse so that we can be more mindful of it?
Yeah, so I think in terms of some of the things that are more specific to rainbow identities, feelings of isolation or unsupportive environments are a really big one. That's something people contacted Outline about a lot. We saw that exacerbated during COVID lockdowns, where people were perhaps trapped in these unsupportive environments. But if you are say, living in a rural community where you don't really have in-person community you can connect to, or if you're a young person who's trapped at home, that environment makes a huge difference. And if you don't have people that you can connect with who share your identity, that can have a really big impact on people's well-being. Yeah, as I alluded to before, we are seeing increasing homophobia and especially transphobia in the past couple of years. As trans people's rights are being used as this political football. You know, we saw under the last government some really good progress. We saw the banning of conversion practices and the gender self-identification under the Births, Deaths, Marriages, Relationships Registration Bill. But we, as part of that progress, had massive amounts of transphobic and homophobic discussion back sort of in the public domain, including from politicians. And that was something that was really prevalent and kind of upped the toxicity of the atmosphere. And then, of course, we're seeing this with the current government and the election campaign as well, with rollbacks on relationship and sexuality education being inclusive in schools, something that I think most people can see is a really positive thing for people to be able to see themselves and understand themselves in that environment. And people just, taking this sort of quite basic concept of letting people live their lives as they want to and turning it into a political issue.
So I guess maybe it would be helpful for our audience around understanding what does it mean to be in an unsupportive environment, and what does it mean to experience homophobia or transphobia? Because I think that part of the issue is sometimes we act in ways that is unintentional. That we're not intentionally trying to hurt people, we're not intentionally trying to demonstrate homophobia. But what are common ways in which we could monitor how we behave or the environment that we create to reduce this?
Yeah, I mean, a really important step is being willing to learn more about what these experiences are, whether that's listening to people in your life, or maybe it's seeking out some sort of media, reading some of these reports. I mean, we've talked about a few already, but Counting Ourselves is a national wellbeing survey that's been run twice now. They've published the results of the 2019 survey, and the 2022 ones will be coming out soon, I think, which is specifically focused on trans and non-binary people's experiences in Aotearoa. And it really does an excellent job of capturing both the population level, but also these individual experiences of what it is like to either explicitly face discrimination or some of these sort of more implicit, unintentional things that you're talking about. And I think that's a really excellent starting point to then understand, okay, I have a sense of what these people are dealing with and therefore how I might be able to support and help. I mean, Outline is also a good resource. I'm not there anymore, but I think there's really excellent people providing those support services, particularly the phone line and chat service are ones where they are for rainbow people, but they're not exclusively for rainbow people. So if you're a parent or a colleague or a support person of a rainbow person and you have a question or you want to learn more, you can absolutely give them a call, and they're there to kind of support and answer those questions. Because sometimes part of the problem can be if you've got a rainbow person in your life, you don't necessarily want to be going to them saying, explain your identity to me and explain how I can support you and explain what pronouns are, because that's putting a lot of work onto them. Some people are very happy to be that person, but other people just want to kind of live their lives without having to explain their existence. So going to some of these other resources like Outline's helpline and like some of the other rainbow organizations with resources up on their websites is a really valuable place to start. I think a lot of it is just around not making assumptions, being open to being corrected, learning how to rethink about things like pronouns. It can be something that feels really intimidating for people thinking about it for the first time, but it really does get very easy once you've had a bit of practice and you've realigned your thinking a little bit. And it's really just a matter of showing kind of basic respect for people. You know, people can tell when people are trying and make an innocent mistake and are willing to just kind of like move forward versus when they're being malicious about it.
And, you know, obviously, one of the things that we do is support workplaces to be more inclusive. What are the ways in which you have found that workplaces haven't been supportive of the rainbow community?
Yeah, I mean, there are all sorts of ways that this can pop up. We actually have a workplace resource, or Outline has a workplace resource on its website that's particularly looking at trans and non-binary inclusion, but thinking about things like in the hiring process, are you A, making sure that you're not explicitly discriminating against people, but B, thinking about some of the obstacles that would be coming up for someone who is going through the process? Like sometimes employers ask for ID really early in the process, but for trans people, that can be something that's quite difficult. You know, going through the legal process of getting everything changed can be expensive and time consuming. So not everyone has ID that actually reflects their identity. And that's something where being able to get further into the process and know, okay, it feels like this is going well and that I might want to work for this company and I feel committed to this process, is something that, rather than having to do that upfront and then not knowing kind of what the vibe of things are, can make a difference. Also, just generally thinking about like, how is your workplace set up in terms of culture, but also physical infrastructure and policies? You know, if someone is working for you who is non-binary, is not a man or a woman, is there a bathroom that they'll be able to use? Do you have a dress code, and how is that going to influence things if people are transitioning, or if they're if they're non-binary? And then policy, sort of like, do you have stuff in place to support people who are transitioning? Is it really clear in your culture that discrimination won't be tolerated from people who are working there, but also potentially from customers or clients if that's something that's coming up? Like, how are you going to protect people if that's an issue that's taking place in the workplace? So all sorts of really practical things you can do, as well as obviously just, you know, treating people like humans and respecting their identities.
Does that mean that therefore what places can do to create safe spaces is literally just to do the opposite of what you've outlined? Or
again, a lot of those sort of practical things around thinking about what's your policy and advertising that as well, you know, putting something on your website or wherever your hiring process takes place to kind of outline how you can support people in the workplace. Having a pride group is something that I think a lot of workplaces find really beneficial for allowing people to kind of build that community together. Yeah.
that's cool. And, you know, when you think about, you know, for example, if you are experiencing some challenges in the workplace, what's the best way to, you know, raise this concern that you find have been most effective? Or should it be something that's not really discussed at all?
It very much would depend from case to case and depending on the workplace. If you've got a supportive manager who can sort of deal with anything that's arising, any issues, then that's really great and definitely the way to go. But similarly, if it doesn't feel like a safe space and you just need to keep your job, then you should not at all feel bad about not sharing what's going on, or particularly sort of whether you come out or not is a really personal case-by-case decision. I mean, discrimination in an employment context is illegal. So there are resources like the Human Rights Commission are able to support with going through a complaints process if it gets to that point. But assuming that you've got supportive management and a supportive environment and the issue is something else that's going on, then hopefully being able to go to them. And again, some of the organisations out there like Outline, like Gender Minorities, Aotearoa, can potentially help with going through that process if you don't have a sort of support person who can already help you. But if you do have an ally, whether that's another rainbow person or a straight cis ally in your workplace who you can talk to and who can support you through any issues that are coming up, then that's also a really useful thing to have.
Well, I'd love to get into, you know, some of the areas that you're really interested in, which is how do we improve this access to support, supporting this community and the use of technology in doing that. And one of the things you briefly talked about is, you know, how people might not really be comfortable yet to share, and so having stigma-free spaces or safe spaces that allows for anonymity is still really important. And, you know, that's something that, like, you know, when Clearhead has our basically our digital assistant, it allows people to do to sort of reach out for help in a stigma-free way. But I'd be keen to hear your perspective on what it means to have safe online spaces and the tools that are available to help support this community.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, as I mentioned, I did my thesis in this space and then have continued to work on it through that role at Outline. I am a really strong advocate for digital spaces and the use of digital technology to connect rainbow people. I mean, some of the themes that came up when I was speaking to young people as part of my thesis were that it was really a critical tool for helping people explore their identities, like learn what it might be to be a trans person or a bisexual person or whatever it might be. Also about being able to find community, being able to find other people like yourself and feel like you're not the only one, that you're not alone, that other people understand that shared experience. And then also just being able to build friendships and relationships with others if you aren't able to or don't prefer to do that in the sort of physical space that are around you. I pulled a quote from my thesis that speaks specifically to the sort of idea of a safe space online. One of the young trans people I spoke to said of kind of their digital spaces, it's just so comforting in that, you know, there's other people out there who accept you and there's people who are like you. And you can just talk to them about anything. Like the circle I've collected, they're great. I love my friends in real life, but it's different. So kind of speaking to that community relationship building stuff that might not be available offline. And that's going to vary for different people as well. So particularly, as I mentioned earlier, if you're based rurally, if you're disabled, if you just don't have a place that you can kind of explore your identity safely in person, or you're not ready to do that, then having the ability to do so online first can be really, really crucial. And I think the idea of safe spaces and safety is a really interesting one as well. It's kind of exploded in recent years, but it really did originate in the concept of rainbow communities creating physical safe spaces in decades past, but has come across to thinking about these digital spaces as well. And, you know, not just being safe from specific instances of harassment or violence, that's certainly part of it, but being able to escape from the constant potential threat of discrimination that comes from being in spaces that aren't really actively queer and trans affirming. So you kind of never know as a rainbow person when you might encounter someone who is either going to make assumptions about you or is actually actively going to be against queer people. So having a space where you can feel fairly confident that you're with people who get it, who are like you, is a really important thing for people to have in the context of that sort of wider homophobic, transphobic society that we're still kind of living in. In terms of some of the issues, I guess, with digital connection and digital spaces, I've pulled again. So from the most recent Counting Ourselves survey, they asked this population of trans and non-binary people across Aotearoa, how often in the last 12 months have you seen negative messages related to trans or non-binary people on social media? Cumulatively, 60% said between weekly and daily, and only 3% said that they hadn't in the last 12 months. So that's a really clear indication of the intense levels of harassment and discrimination that do exist online. It's certainly not a utopia by any means. And, you know, there are all sorts of harassment, trolling, and abuse that can take place. And furthermore, the structures aren't really built to support rainbow people. People create their own spaces online in really powerful ways, but these social media platforms are often kind of ambivalent at best about the existence of rainbow people. Rainbow perspectives often aren't built in to these tech platforms or to the policies that are governing them. We see this in, you know, things consistently getting marked by algorithms as being not safe for work when it might just be a queer person talking about their identity, or something that is perfectly safe for work, but because there's that association of being queer with being sort of adult content, that gets baked in and reinforced by kind of the algorithms that increasingly are driving our experiences of the internet. Or similarly, people can use the tools that are now available to us to increase their harassment and to push that transphobic, homophobic, biphobic content into people's online experiences. So there's a lot of good, but there's also a lot of issues that make it not as good as it could be.
You mentioned, you know, that people would troll others, etc. And to me, that's just another form of bullying. And one thing you want to do in terms of reducing bullying is not to be a bystander and not do anything about it. So what would you advise others who are maybe observing behaviors that are not very inclusive, and what's the best way to support someone in those moments?
Yeah, again, complicated question, but there are some basic things that you can do in terms of reporting content if it does feel like it's targeting someone that may or may not result in a positive outcome because of some of the failings of our platforms, but still something that you can do. But I also think just reaching out to support that person, make sure they're okay. And for people themselves, if you're experiencing this kind of harassment, first of all, it's not your fault. You haven't done anything to bring that on just by existing as a person online. But it does become a matter of people, unfortunately, kind of having to protect themselves by figuring out different tools that they can lean on, whether that's blocking people or creating spaces that are carved off. And there's just not enough infrastructure there at the moment to really do that in effective ways. But people are pretty creative and resilient and do what they can in the face of these kind of structural problems online.
And you've mentioned a couple of times now that the infrastructure isn't there. What does it look like once it is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably not our current system where everything is owned by these big tech companies who are driven by profit motives, and any sort of moderation is increasingly becoming clear that it's not possible at the scales that these companies have grown to. It certainly doesn't help that some of them, like Twitter/X, have given up on trying. But I think we need to figure out ways to build community online that are not driven by those profit motives, which is an easy problem to solve. But sort of some of the things that could be done in the meantime would be more rainbow-informed policies and moderation, because so often it's one of those things where when people are reporting harassment, it doesn't get taken seriously, or it's done in ways that the moderators don't have the context to understand it is a form of harassment. And then on the other side, that things can kind of get reported and taken down by rainbow people. So I think we need a radically different model than what we have. But when people can create sort of pockets of spaces for themselves, that can be really powerful. It's just unfortunate that those often are then private and kind of withheld from public view to protect the people involved, which makes it really hard for people to then connect when they are trying to find community online, which I guess is where some of these organizations like Rainbow Youth, Inside Out, Outline, Gender Minorities, and many, many others across the country can kind of help people point them in the right directions.
And, one of the things that we sort of started off at the beginning was, recognizing that for Pacifica, for Indigenous community, they have a different layer of experience that they navigate through being queer. And how does colonization affect the community? Or just broadly, what are the other considerations that we have to take into account when we're thinking about Indigenous community and the intersection with being queer?
So this is a massive question that I can't really do justice in a few minutes' time, but it was colonization which introduced British gender roles to this country, which suppressed and erased the takatapui identities that existed before colonization, introduced laws that made it illegal to be gay for many, many years. And, we had similar dynamics occurring through colonization across the Pacific as well. And then we've also seen that Māori and Pacifica people have frequently been further marginalised within what have been sort of historically and to some extent still are Pākehā-dominated organisations and spaces in rainbow communities that doesn't have sufficient space for understanding those identities that are both rainbow in the sense of sexual gender identity, etc., but also about that cultural identity as well. There's a lot of incredible work across both new and old organisations that have popped up. I almost don't want to list them because I'm scared that I'll miss some out, but nevertheless, Moana Wā, Fine, Pacifica, Te Whanawhana, Mana Tipua, Mana Ora, Mana Anuanua, the Manawangi Project, Village Collective. There are others as well. That's certainly not an exhaustive list, but there are a lot of places that are doing really important work to uplift takatapui and MVP FAF plus communities that can hold that complexity and create space for people who've kind of historically been doubly marginalised within a colonial, post-colonial New Zealand society. I also think important to acknowledge that, the ongoing impacts of colonisation that feel very salient always, but particularly right now, the current attacks on Te Tiriti and Te Ao Māori, including, the establishment of Te Aka Whaiora, the Māori Health Authority, which was starting to undertake really important mahi to support the health and well-being of Takatapui communities that will not necessarily be able to happen now because of the decisions that the current government is making. So there are a lot of people out there who can speak to these issues much better than I can, but there's a lot of things that come into play when thinking about that goes beyond just the rainbow side of things.
And I guess if there's one thing that we could do to better support these individuals, what would you say?
In terms of better supporting rainbow people, I mean, it's a big thing, but it really just comes down to dismantling anti-rainbow discrimination at every level. So interpersonally, people doing the work to learn about these experiences and identities, structurally understanding how discrimination plays out in the context of housing, education, employment, all sorts of other spheres of life. And then legislatively, we still are often considered an afterthought when it comes to different, health legislation or housing, thinking about how education operates. It's not unusual still for rainbow people to not be considered a priority population or kind of left to the side when these issues often are really, really salient for people who are trying to live their lives and not be oppressed in the context of doing so. So that's my one thing, but there's obviously a lot that is involved in that. But at the same time, I think it's also important to not be so overwhelmed by how big that is, because we know that these mental health disproportionate burden on rainbow people is so much because of discrimination. It means that we can fix it. It's just a matter of tackling that discrimination, including, at the individual level, doing what we can to learn about and support rainbow people in our lives. That might be things like submitting when things are going through Parliament, or signing petitions, or attending events, standing up against homophobia, transphobia. If someone makes a comment, then not just letting that slide. I think it's really important for people, if they're looking to be allies, to not just do that when they know there's a rainbow person in the room, because A, there might be someone there and they're not going to feel safe if they don't think that there are people in their lives who are willing to stand up against this sort of thing. And B, it's the right thing to do regardless for the community, whether someone's in the room or not.
So I guess when you talk about being an ally in the workplace, how do you do that well without coming across, patronizing or Yeah,
great question. I think following people's lead is the really key one. So if there's a pride group at your organization, then figuring out what they are working to change or what they're doing and being able to support them in that. If there isn't something like that, then just listening to sort of what are some of the key issues, figuring out where you might be able to drive change. And again, I think the more that you can do to shift culture, but also shift structures, thinking about what your organization's policies are, that can be really beneficial. The most important thing that we've seen for supporting the well-being of trans and non-binary young people is a supportive whānau. Even if that's just one person, that makes a colossal difference in terms of ensuring that we are trying to minimize the impacts of societal discrimination and protect people and make sure that they can have those more positive mental health outcomes rather than some of the negative ones we kind of started off talking about. There are some really good resources available. Be-there.nz, be-there.nz is a website that was put together by a collective of rainbow organizations that's really aimed at supporting parents and whānau who might have a child who's coming out or transitioning. But yeah, ultimately, it's really about listen to your child, follow their lead, support them, show that you love them, and the rest is kind of take it as it comes. But that's the thing that is really important.
Well, a lot of this has to start with you taking the time to understand the challenges that they face, understand what it means to them. So did you have any other resources that you recommend for understanding gender fluidity? Because I believe that it's not something that a lot of people understand, for example.
Yeah, again, great organizations like gender minorities. Aotearoa, their website has lots of great resources. Again, outline, you can call up, chat to someone, any questions that you've got. I'm sure that there are other things as well, but those are kind of the two that come immediately to mind.
Awesome. Well, one of the pieces of work that you managed to work through outline was launching the Beyond Binary project, where, being able to use a code to add to a website to make the data forms and fields more gender inclusive. What did you learn from that exercise? And, are there other things that we can do?
Yeah, so I really loved that project. It was dealing with the issue that we see kind of really prevalently across not just online, but online as well, of these very binary gendered forms where you're signing up to something and you have to give maybe an honorific, you have to give potentially your gender, pronouns, various things that it might be asking, and it only gives you the options man and woman or Mrs., Ms., Mr., and that leaves people who don't identify in those boxes really stuck, having to either misgender themselves or not being able to access what the service is. And it's a really easy fix, is a matter of figuring out, okay, well, how do we make those forms more inclusive by adding different options? But also something that was really important to me during that process was that it wouldn't just be kind of like rainbow washing the way that people approach data collection and saying, okay, well, if we collect information about who's non-binary, we can better market to the non-binary people. But instead actually really rethinking, well, what does it mean to be asking these questions? Why does an organization feel like it needs those data points? A lot of the times you don't actually need to know you very often don't need to know someone's sex. You quite often don't actually need to know someone's gender. If you're addressing them, you might need to know how they want to be addressed in terms of Ms., mix, that sort of thing. You might need their name. Maybe you need pronouns if there's a context where you're going to be talking about them to other people. But actually really critically thinking through and creating these flows of, well, why are you collecting the data? What's the purpose? And then actually only asking the things that are needed and really taking that kind of privacy first approach, because that's something that came through as well when surveying non-binary people, was some of them really wanted to be able to sort of express, I'm non-binary and I want to be able to select X as my gender marker, or I want to be able to have ways to express that. But for other people, it was, I actually don't think that you should have to have this information. It's not relevant. And so being able to create space for both of those.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? I think it can be quite dichotomous sometimes, which is at one side of the spectrum is people feeling the need for privacy, and then at the same time, if you don't collect that information, then they don't feel seen and heard. So it's being able to give, in some ways, both options. I feel. Yeah.
So that was something that really came through, is all of these questions always having prefer not to answer or something to that effect. And you can, as with anything under the Privacy Act, be clear of, well, if you don't provide this information to us, we won't be able to provide this service, but making sure that you're giving the agency to people rather than kind of just taking it from them. And I see that someone's asked a similar question in the chat about capturing employee data, capturing gender data as male, female, non-binary, and whether you should also be capturing whether people are trans. Probably a lot of the time, no, but it depends. It depends on your why, as with all of these things. If that's something where it's because there's a reason that you need to have kind of the population level data to be able to make sure that you're supporting trans employees, then maybe there's a rationale there. But again, it's really thinking about what's the purpose of what we're doing this, and what burden will it put on people? Will people feel uncomfortable having to answer that question, or is it something that people actually want to be able to express? And how identifiable will people be? There's a real difference, obviously, between doing like these population workplace surveys where you then know, okay, X% of people said they're bisexual, X% said that they're trans, versus people having to provide that information attached to their name and not necessarily knowing who's going to see that.
And so much of this is, in some ways making sure you have the agency to make these changes, and rather than doing things two people, actually this whole concept around, for us by us kind of concept. So, one of the things you've mentioned a couple of times now is this idea about creating a pride group in the workplace, and using them as an example on what is the right thing to say or do, and be a much more helpful ally. Do you have any suggestion on how to create these pride groups or safe spaces in the workplace? Does it have to be done by a rainbow community member? Therefore, someone has to volunteer that, that this is their identity, this is what they want to do? Or how do you encourage the rainbow community to join it? And especially if they're trying to, maybe it hasn't always traditionally been a safe space, and now they're trying to create this safe space, but then you have to almost go through historical trauma in some ways that, so how do you navigate all of that in the workplace?
Yeah, good questions, particularly that question of does it have to be a rainbow person, because that can be a bit of a trap sometimes of if we say, anyone who's going to be part of this group has to be rainbow, that potentially forces people to come out. Like, you don't necessarily know, unless someone is walking around saying, like, I am 100% a straight cisgender ally, then you don't actually know. It could be someone who hasn't come out to you but is part of the community. So I think it's always really important to be careful about making assumptions about what people's identities are, if they haven't said them. And then, of course, things can always change over time as well as people learn things about themselves. I think it is important to follow rainbow people's lead, as I said earlier, but it might be something where allies could decide, we see a problem here, maybe there's no one out at our company, and that suggests that it's probably not a safe environment, unless it's a very small workplace. Statistically, most workplaces do have rainbow people. It's just a matter of whether they feel comfortable sharing that in that workplace. But I think if you are going to do it as an ally, just being really sort of receptive to hearing from rainbow people about what their priorities are, following their lead, and trying to make a difference. Also, something that I think can be really beneficial on both sides, coming from someone who was in the rainbow charity space, is figuring out ways that you can connect with some of those charities as an organization. So, at Outline, we had connections with Spark. They were a strategic partner for many years. DLA Piper provides sort of legal services for us, and those become really reciprocal relationships where it's not just a matter of, they have lots of resourcing and can provide support and run fundraisers and do all sorts of things that are really beneficial, but then Outline or whoever the charity is can in turn offer support around making sure that they're doing rainbow inclusion in their workplace in ways that feel authentic.
And I think that to summarize what you've said is it's always good to be able to follow the lead of someone from the rainbow community if they are comfortable and have publicly sort of shared their identity. But otherwise, these groups are best, I guess, being mixed so that there's no assumption that you're forcing people to be to out their identity before they're ready because they joined this group, and just really, as much as possible, just have people kind of share their perspective and kind of learn from that. That sounds good. And of course, whenever we see much more public-private partnerships, that's always a much more sustainable way of driving change at a mainstream level. And is there anything else you'd like to share, Claire, that you haven't already?
I guess just coming off the back of that question, I just wanted to add that, when I say follow rainbow people's lead, I don't mean find one rainbow person and follow them, because as we said at the start, massive diversity of experience. Someone who's queer and cisgender is not necessarily an expert on trans people's experiences. And similarly, one trans person does not necessarily know about the sort of breadth of diversity that falls under everyone's experiences who might use that label. So it's a matter of following rainbow community, rainbow people's lead. Certainly if you've got rainbow people in your workplace, listening to them, but not expecting them to be the sort of expert on all things rainbow, because they're just a person like you are.
Yeah, 100%. And I think what you've done really well today is just share where all the different places you can find resources, because it sounds like there is a lot out there. It's just that we have to do our homework to take the time to read it and understand it, and then ultimately implement it in a safe way. Is there anything else you'd like to share that we haven't covered already yet?
Oh, good question. Oh, well, one thing we haven't discussed, but relevant in the context of talking about rainbow mental health and some of the challenges, there's all the things that kind of come from experiences of coming out, experiencing discrimination, but there's also an added layer in the context that a lot of mental health professionals don't know as much as they should about rainbow experiences. It's not something that there's any sort of requirement in training programs for the most part to
I can
actually
say that
learn
we
about.
were, like, through my training as a doctor, I didn't get any training on it.
Yeah, you might get one lecture, but it's certainly not something that's like integrated throughout psychological medical trainings. And that's a real problem because rainbow people are a not insignificant part of the population who have experiences shaped by their identities, both in the context of mental health and also health, physical health. And so it means that people might be experiencing some sort of mental health distress or just wanting some support. And then when they try and find that support, it's not available. Or, you know, at worst, you have someone who might be actively making comments, you know, that's not real, or sort of not using the right pronouns, or being really dismissive of someone's identity. But even on the slightly less bad side, you get people who are really well-intentioned but don't know that much. And so the client ends up having to explain what their identity is, what it means to someone who's meant to be supporting them. Someone's just shared the Rainbow Mental Health resource that Gloria Fraser made, which I was going to mention as well. It's a really excellent one that explores both the experiences of people going through mental health support as rainbow people, and then provides a lot of advice to professionals as well about how they can upskill and learn. But yeah, really important to not put that burden of explaining and justifying on people who are the ones coming for support. And that's in part why organisations like Outline exist, so that, you know, when people are coming to call the helpline or to get more in-depth counselling, they're coming to rainbow people who have that lived experience and then also have rainbow specific training on top of that to make sure that they can hopefully really understand those experiences. And there's a lot more that can kind of be taken for granted as shared understandings, but it's not enough for them to be rainbow specialist services, which are often very underfunded as well. It's really important that people can go to mainstream services and still receive rainbow competent support. So there's a lot of work to do in that space.
And I guess the final thing to maybe close off is, obviously, you know, when you shared about all the things that you've done at Outline, it was a very comprehensive service. There was like counseling, there was phone line, there was that chat functionality that you launched recently, there was manager support, peer support. Did you have any insights on what really worked?
Yeah, so I think in some ways the answer is that it depends. I think that the helpline / chat service have some real benefits in terms of that's something that people can just call up or message. I mean, one of the things that's great about the chat is that if people aren't comfortable calling, or if they've got some sort of disability or environment where they can't call, it provides another modality where they can do that. And that's talking to trained volunteers. So that's sort of that model of doing things, which can be really beneficial. Counselling provides more in-depth ongoing support. It's short-term counselling, but it still provides that sort of more able to dig into things for the specialist counsellor. And then trans-peer support is similar in that it's got the one-to-one component. There's also some groups, but it's not as clinically focused. It's more about providing that peer support. So I don't think that anyone is like the best one or better than the others. I think it really depends on the kind of support that you're looking for at that point in time. And often we see people move between services within the organisation, that they might call up and then end up going to trans-peer support and then maybe having some counselling and bouncing around, or people might just use one service and kind of feel like that's met their need.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we talked a lot about it from almost like a very negative lens, if I'm honest. I'd love to hear your perspective from an employer's, you know, or workplace wanting to take more of a pride celebration. You know, what do you suggest? Is it getting a speaker in? Is it like education packs, or is it throwing a party? What's the best thing to do to kind of celebrate it rather than just sort of come from this lens of deficiency kind of thing?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. I think there's room for both. I don't think that workplaces should be celebrating if they are like not doing the work behind the scenes, because then that's very much like just celebrating the organization. Look how great we are. when you maybe don't actually have the support that's needed for people in the workplace. But yeah, getting speakers in. I know a lot of the different organizations are very willing to coordinate that sort of thing. Can be a really great opportunity. But pay people from rainbow organizations to do so. Education, that sort of thing. But yeah, it can also just be an opportunity for rainbow people in the workplace to kind of celebrate their identities as well. I mean, more generally, people will sometimes talk about the fact that, in an ideal world, organizations like Outline wouldn't exist because we would have done away with transphobia, homophobia, wouldn't have to worry, there'd be no need for a rainbow mental health organization, which is something I actually quite strongly disagree with. I think that there are parts of the experience of being a rainbow person, whether that's coming out and figuring out new ways of doing a relationship and identity in the world and expression, or transitioning. I think inherently that is an experience that can be complicated, even in an ideal world where you're not facing discrimination. But it would be much more strengths-based. It would be kind of a chance for people to celebrate learning about themselves and coming to be in the world without having to deal with all those sort of heavy weights that come with worrying about rejection or isolation or discrimination. So I think there's a lot of room to celebrate being queer, and it's just a shame that we have to spend so much energy fighting back against people who want to take away rights.
I love to hear from you, we talked a lot about here are the unique challenges that being queer means that I have to face. Like, what are the things that is a strength, I guess, of being queer?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I think you get a different perspective on the world, and it can create empathy for sort of other people's experiences in a way that you might not get otherwise. Or, not to say that no one outside of the community can have those experiences, but it is one way in to learning more about what it is to exist in the world in different ways. And just rethinking, we don't have to do things just because they're the norm or it's the way things have always been done. There are some really exciting possibilities for living in different ways and celebrating living in different ways that I think are really at the core of being a rainbow person, being part of these communities, and the community as well. I think is a really positive thing for the most part, where you get to find other people and share in these experiences together.
That's awesome. I mean, you did share at the beginning of the webinar that you are part of the community, and we also spoke quite a bit about having strong allyship for the community. Can you share an example of something an ally had said or done that really still resonated with you today?
Yeah, I mean, one of my friends who's a straight person, a cisgender person, an ally, was the person who really drove building a relationship between DLA Piper, the law firm, and Outline. Like, so much of that was her seeing that there was a possibility for the place she was working to be able to be doing more for the rainbow community, talk to the people in her workplace, got it moving, and then was an ongoing point of contact for support for us. So I think that sort of thing, where it's seeing an opportunity to support, talking to the relevant people to make sure that it would be helpful, and then helping make it happen. That will stick with me for a very long time, that she made that happen. And that relationship, neither of us are at those organizations anymore, but the relationship is continuing on from those choices and actions.
Amazing. And obviously helping way more people in the community because of it. Well, we have a closing question we ask all our guests. What is one wellbeing practice that you do to stay well, Claire?
Oh, I love reading. All sorts, whether that's, I've been getting into poetry recently, but also novels, interesting nonfiction books. Always important for me to make time to step away from whatever work or life things are going on, and make sure that I'm making that time for myself.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.